Thank you for choosing to watch our video. Please like and subscribe to our channel and click the bell icon for notifications of new content. Leave us a comment and watch the other videos that we're happy to provide for you. And now, on to the sermon.
In 1897, Jan Stejka, a Polish painter, was commissioned to paint the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. This is an absolutely amazing picture for one reason. It's the largest canvas painting in the world. So I'm going to give you some numbers here. These numbers, I tell you, are accurate. This painting is 45 feet tall and 195 feet long. That's 8,775 square feet. It is the size of 4 average American homes put together. Just so you'll believe me, here is a picture, and inside the red circle are 2 people who are standing at the bottom of this painting. It's unbelievable. It is displayed in its own purpose-built hall in Glendale, California. Now, oddly enough, the whole reason that I bring this up is not to nerd out about this painting, but to make the point that when Jan Stejka presented Jesus in this painting, and I'm not here to advocate for any kind of representations of Jesus Christ, I'm only here to comment about his. He didn't portray Jesus on the cross. He portrayed Him in those moments just before He was put on the cross. And He's standing there, this lone, solitary figure, kind of looking above, if you can see it, awaiting what's going to take place. Cross of Jesus Christ was, far and away, the most important event that ever happened in history. And it was something that was planned. It was something that was ready to be executed from the very beginning. I ask you to turn to Revelation chapter 13 in the 8th verse. And Revelation chapter 13, it begins to set up this conflict, particularly with the beast and with the saints of God. But there is a point at which in verse 8 where it's talking about how these people are going to resist this beast. Those are going to be the saints of God. And those people are following Jesus Christ, who it says there, who is the Lamb that's slain before the foundation of the world. So we come and we commemorate the Lamb that was slain before the foundation of the world. But back to Mr. Stejka's painting. If you're able to see it, on the far right, you have the city of Jerusalem. And Hebrews chapter 13, verse 12 talks about them going outside of the gate. So at that current time, it was outside of the gate of the city. And it's this enormous panorama of all of these different people who are going and approaching to witness the crucifixion of Jesus. And I can imagine they were young, they were old, they were important, they were not important. There were people from every single walk of life, every single class of society, there for every single reason. And they all make an impact on us when we put it all together to kind of consider, what are we? What are we? I'm going to suggest to you when we go through the lesson, there's 4 different groups of people, four different classes of people as we approach the cross of Jesus Christ in the account of it in the Gospels. And the same 4 groups of people, we're not going to necessarily break these down into individuals, but just look at them kind of collectively as groups, because the real key is, the real issue that can weigh on the heart is that there's the same types of people still at the cross of Jesus Christ, even today. And that's why it's so relevant to us. It's more than just a story. It's a narrative. And that narrative explains humanity. So let's see what humanity looked like. First of all, we're going to talk about people who were just simply hardened at the cross. I'm going to try to take this in a stepwise fashion. And if this makes sense to you at the end of the lesson, then we've got to begin with the people who were hardened at the cross. And the people who were hardened at the cross, mainly I want to just speak of the people who were out there. Mark chapter 15. Let's look in the 13th and the 14th verses. These were people who were just cold. They had no empathy, they had no sympathy, they had no pity, they had no sorrow for this man who hung on the cross. In Matthew chapter 15 and verses 13 and 14, they cried out again, "Crucify him." Then Pilate said, "Why, what evil has he done?" But they cried out all the more, "Crucify him." Even in the parallel accounts, they even go further and say, "Let his blood be on us." But crucify him. Matthew chapter 27, let's look in verses 41 and 43. Matthew chapter 27, and we'll come back to the Roman guards later on in the lesson. But Matthew chapter 27 and looking in verse 41. Matthew 27, verse 41. "Likewise, the chief priest also, mocking with the scribes and the elders, said, He saved others, himself he cannot save. If he is the King of Israel, let him now come down from the cross, and we'll believe him. He trusted in God. Let him deliver him now if he will have him, for he said, I am the Son of God." It didn't matter to them that this unbelievable injustice was being done. It didn't matter about all of the supernatural events that were going on during the whole spelling out of not just his arrest and trial, but now during the crucifixion. It didn't matter at all. It didn't make an impact. They knew. Peter was going to say just a few weeks later in Acts chapter 2, verse 23, that it was by your lawless hands, some versions say it was by your wicked hands, Acts 2:23, that all of this was perpetrated. Why? Because people are hardened. Now, I just want to make the comment that there are still a lot of people who are hardened today. A lot of people who ridicule everything, spiritually speaking. If you kind of had to lay out a Hall of Fame of atheists and unbelievers, I suppose that you could pick these three. These are the three that I chose to come and talk to you about this morning. We have Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens. Both of them made a tremendous name for themselves and actually a pretty good living by ridiculing everything that relates to God and the Bible and Jesus Christ and religion in general. On the far right, you had Madalyn Murray O'Hair. For those of you in the audience who don't know her contribution to the last 60 years of American society in the early 1960s as an atheist, she was instrumental in getting prayer removed from schools, which is interesting how that whole issue kind of keeps circulating back and forth throughout culture. I'm not really here to talk about the idea of prayer in schools. What I do want to just mention to you is one of her quotes. I'm not here to talk about the philosophical debate, should prayer be in school, and what did it do when it was put in, what did it do when you took it out. I don't care about that in the lesson. I do care about what she thinks in her heart. Here's what she said. "This would be the best of all possible worlds if everybody were an atheist. I'm an atheist because religion is a crutch, and only cripples need crutches. I will engage in sexual activity with any consenting male, anytime, at any place I well please." If you ever go looking for that quote, yes, I had to edit it out. So I'm just here to warn you, what you find is not what I just read. Guys, that's a heart that's hardened. It's a heart that's hardened. And in Romans chapter 1, that's what you see. In Romans chapter 1 and verse 18, and when you have conversations with atheists, you'll see that hardening that's there. Romans chapter 1 makes the point that there is sufficient evidence that's there to open your heart to God. And if you can open your heart to God and believe that He exists, then you move on and you begin to look at, is Jesus Christ real? Does He exist? Then you begin to move on, well, is His Word real? Does it exist? Now, you might move that order around. I really don't have any argument with that. But you begin to open your heart to a spiritual possibility. What does it say in Romans chapter 1, verse 18? It says that they suppress the truth in unrighteousness. The truth is there. The evidence is there. But why do people not choose to do it? They suppress the truth in unrighteousness. In Romans chapter 1, verse 30, and I brought this up in other times, that leads a lot of people to become what? Haters of God. Haters of God. Now, I have control, I have power over what I do with my heart, just like you do. And the author of Hebrews, multiple times, as you can see in front of the screen before you, multiple times refers, taking it back from one of the Psalms, Psalm 95, makes the admonition to these people who are Christians and who are kind of wavering. Harden not your heart. Don't harden your heart. You've got control over it. Don't harden your heart. Some of the people around the cross, they had hardened hearts, and it closed them off to spiritual possibilities. Possibilities that could be life-changing, but possibilities that aren't that incredible. They aren't that mind-bendingly stupid to believe in them and to accept them and to live your life by them. Not at all. Don't harden your heart. That's the kind of people that was around the cross. But let's think about another group, and that was people who were indifferent. People who were indifferent. Now, in this particular point, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the Roman soldiers, because the Roman soldiers, as they move in and out of the account with the arrest and the trial and the crucifixion, they are just people who, for lack of a different way of saying it, or maybe even lack of a better way of saying it, they're just doing their job. It's just crucifixion day. You know, every Tuesday is crucifixion day, just like every Tuesday is surgery day at the hospital. I don't know what the day is. I'm just making that up. They do have a day, though. However, I just don't know which day. I just don't know which day it is. It's just crucifixion day. Was it more than that? Yes, it was more than that. But a lot of people are just indifferent. So let's go to Matthew chapter 27, for example. Matthew chapter 27. This time we're just going to back up a little bit in the account. Let's look in verse 35. Let's look in verse 35. So when they crucified Him and they divided His garments, casting lots, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet, they divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Sitting down, they kept watch over Him there. They were materialistic. The Roman law gave them the ability to take those garments, and that garment was kind of a spoil. It was kind of a little bit of an extra payment for them. So they were going to cast these lots to try to decide what to do with the clothes of the Son of God. From beginning of the account to the end. And what I mean by this is when you look in, for example, John chapter 18, they're in part of the plot to arrest Jesus. Then you move on into the account in Luke chapter 22 and verses 63 through 65. When they bring Him in, they're engaging in the initial mocking of Jesus Christ. They actually mocked Him twice. So they're engaged in that initial mocking. As it moves on into John chapter 19, this is where they weave the crown of thorns, they put it on him, they beat him again. You move on into Luke chapter 23 and verse 34. That's when the scourging takes place, and after the scourging, they mock him a second time. He's then nailed to the cross. And Luke chapter 23 and verse 34 is particularly meaningful because it teaches such an incredible lesson without ever saying, here's a lesson. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Just indifferent. Just indifferent. When people come into contact with the gospel, some people are indifferent. I've got some examples for you just to show you. Acts chapter 17. Let's look in verse 32. In Acts chapter 17, when Paul lays out, actually, if you think about this from an atheistic point of view, in Acts chapter 17, verse 32, they were in an agnostic point of view. They had a lot of different gods, so to them, they didn't really know which one was the true one. So Paul goes at the angle of trying to prove that there was a true God. And you can see his argumentation down through, beginning in verse 22 and then ending up about in verse 31, really. Verse 32, though, are the reactions, and that's what I've directed you to. And when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, well, some of them mocked. That's your hardened heart. While others said, we will hear you again on this matter. And that's the phrase that I'm kind of taking as more of the indifference. Did it move the needle with them? Maybe. But if it did, it didn't move it much. Because the next crowd that it mentions in verse 33, so Paul departed from them. However, some men joined him and believed. Among them was Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris and others with them. That really, really moved the needle with them. Acts chapter 25, verse 24. Acts chapter 25 and verse 24. Let's notice there with Felix. Acts chapter 24, verse 25. There, as Paul reasoned about self-righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, famously, Felix was afraid. He trembled. He said, go away for now. When I have a convenient time, I'll call for you. Now, that may have been, admittedly, kind of on the strong side of indifferent, but just go away. I'll deal with it at another time. Again, it didn't really move his heart to respond. Same is true in Acts chapter 26, verse 28. Paul coming from talking about his background and really moving in on Agrippa and telling him, look, this is what the prophets prophesied about. They prophesied about the life of Jesus Christ. You agree with them, don't you? That was a rhetorical question. He knew that Agrippa agreed with them, really making that fervent case. Please obey. And Agrippa, I don't know if you say it with a positive or a negative, but he got close. Almost you persuade me to be a Christian. I guess if you think about where he came from, it was a positive. But if you think about where he ended up, he never made it. He was just indifferent. And brethren, that kind of thinking is distressing, I know. And I want to bring up the fact with a couple of more instances that this indifference is not always indifferent. People can witness some just remarkable things and not come away with it with an indifferent point of view. And I just want to bring up another Roman soldier in Matthew chapter 27 in verse 54. Actually, all of these gospel accounts bring this up, but we'll look in Acts chapter 27 in verse 54. There was a soldier, a Roman centurion. And so the Roman centurion saw everything that was taking place, including those supernatural events, the darkness that had fallen. And he said in Matthew chapter 27 in verse 54, when the centurion and those who were with him, who were guarding Jesus, saw the earthquake and the things that had happened, they feared greatly, saying, truly, this man was the Son of God. This man was the Son of God. He wasn't an ordinary criminal. So what did they see? They saw the same evidence that everyone else saw. I don't know how many people there were around the crucifixion. There's no telling. Mr. Steika, as you can remember back on the picture, and if you look at it really closely, he portrays at least 100 or so people in the picture itself. I don't know how many there were. But think about this. They all saw the same evidence. They all saw the darkness, if that, you know what I mean. They all felt the earthquake. They all had the same experience. And some of them had hardened hearts. Some of them had indifferent hearts. Some of them said, truly, this was the Son of God. Some of them, just think about this. Think about the two thieves. The two thieves, both of them going at Jesus. But one of them has a change of heart. In fact, one of them rebukes the other one. And then he asks Jesus, please be with me. And Jesus said, today you'll be with me in paradise. They all had the same evidence, but some of them walked away far less than just indifferent. Some people were curious. Some people were curious. Mark chapter 15, and let's look in verse 29. Mark chapter 15, looking in verse 29. Mark chapter 15 and looking in verse 29. And there's just simply a statement that says, a phrase that says, and those who passed by. Now those people who passed by, blaspheming, wagging their heads, saying, aha, you who destroyed the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross. Those who passed by. And maybe those people who were passing by were just passing by to see what was going on. We are, and I don't say this in a negative way, it's just a matter of fact, we are extremely insulated from death today. They weren't that way back then. In fact, in reading about crucifixions, you'll see that it was quite the spectacle. It was a show. And there were a lot of people who would go out, literally, just to see what was going on. And so you had people who were reacting out of curiosity. It's morbid curiosity, nevertheless, it's curiosity. Now, for me to make a spiritual point, I want to say this. First of all, curiosity is not always wrong. And I've got a couple of examples for you to think about. Exodus chapter 3. Let's look in Exodus chapter 3. And let's talk about Moses just for a second. Exodus chapter 3, and we're going to start in verse 1. So Exodus chapter 3, verse 1, one of the most well-known instances in all of Moses' life. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the back of the desert. He came to Horeb, the mountain of God. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight. Why does the bush does not burn? He's curious, isn't he? But then verse 4, so when the Lord saw that he had turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses, and he said, here I am. So that little moment of curiosity allowed God to connect with him. I'd make the same case with Nicodemus in John chapter 3. In John chapter 3, admittedly in John chapter 3, the case is not as specifically strong. Here's what I mean. John chapter 3, starting in verse 1. There was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. This man came to Jesus by night and said to him, Rabbi, we know that you're a teacher come from God, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him. However, when we keep on looking through what is left of the Gospel of John and then the book of Acts, you can see that Nicodemus' curiosity to have an audience with Jesus, while it's not specifically stated in John chapter 3, obviously drew him closer to Jesus because he became kind of a secret disciple, is often how Nicodemus is termed, the secret disciple. Now we can debate the secret part, but that's kind of beside the point. He became a disciple. So with Moses and with Nicodemus, what did their curiosity do? Well, their curiosity got them closer to God. And you think about Proverbs chapter 4, verse 7. I've got that in front of us on the screen. Proverbs chapter 4, verse 7. And there's a lot of places like this in the Proverbs. So just picking this one out by way of illustration. Wisdom is the principal thing. Therefore, get wisdom. Get it. Chase after it. Work for it. Look for it. Get wisdom. And in all of your getting, get understanding. Curiosity can be a good thing. But in order for us to have a balanced lesson, at least as far as this point, I've got to talk about curiosity now being a bad thing. Genesis chapter 3, another couple of examples. Genesis chapter 3. And you think about beginning in verse 4, Genesis chapter 3, I'm going to start reading in verse 4. Then the serpent said to the woman, "You will not surely die. For God knows that in the day that you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise. You've got to wonder, was she thinking, what's it going to be like after I take the bite? That curiosity. So she took of its fruit and she ate. She also gave to her husband with her, and he ate. Luke chapter 15. Luke chapter 15. We don't make mention of this very much, but let me just read through this account and let you consider this. Luke chapter 15, and let's start in verse 11. So Luke 15, starting in verse 11. Then he said, "A certain man had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the portion of goods that falls to me.' So he divided to them his livelihood, and not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, journeyed to a far country, and there wasted his possessions with prodigal living." So what do you think he thought about? Does the account tell me? No. And I want to be very, very clear about that. You're looking at the account. We know what the account says. However, we are humans and we know what human nature tells us. How long do you think he was rolling around that far country in his mind, curious as to what life was going to be like? I've got money, I can live, I can survive, I can go to this new place, I can be away from my family. Maybe family life was good, maybe it was bad, we don't know. How long do you think he was curious about it? Same thing with Eve. How curious do you think that was building within her heart to realize what she would be like after she ate that fruit? So, some modern day thoughts. There is a danger of curiosity for everyone. And that danger of curiosity runs along a lot of different sins. I think maybe the most natural one, it's hard for me to be able to know how to exactly put this, so I just got to, just like my mom used to say, you just got to spit it out. So a child could become in their teenage years very transfixed, very curious about what their friends are going through or experiencing. That may lead them to beginning to experiment with drugs and alcohol, which could lead them at least down a path, we know it happens, that can lead them down a path to addiction. A young boy or a young girl could become curious with pornography. That could lead them down the road to premarital sexual relationship. That could, when they're married, lead them out to an extramarital relationship. The point is, curiosity can become kind of that beginning moment of ultimately what leads people away from God. Curiosity led people to God. We've made the examples of that, seen the examples of that. But guys, it can also lead people away from God. And these people who just come around and they're just curious about the cross, that curiosity doesn't serve someone well unless they're willing to let it drive them to what's good. Now let's consider and think about the last group. That is people who are confused. People who are confused. There were people who were confused at the cross. Luke chapter 18 and verse 28. And mainly I want to just discuss the disciples here. In Luke chapter 18, while a point might be made for other groups of people, just in the time confines that we have of the lesson, I'll talk about the disciples just for a moment. Luke chapter 18 verse 28, it's not very far from the time that we've been talking about all morning. Luke 18's pretty far down into the life of Jesus. And Peter makes the comment, "See, we have left all and we have followed you." The Lord goes on and gives him a promise. But the point was, the disciples had left everything, looking for the Messiah, looking for the Christ, which I believe they were convinced they had found. They were looking for a deliverer, which they found. But even that was hazy. Acts chapter 1, verse 6. After His resurrection, they were asking the Lord, are you now going to restore the kingdom of Israel? So they were looking for a deliverer, unfortunately, more in a physical state like a lot of the Jews were looking for. The point was, they were confused because they just didn't quite put everything together. Now the Lord, early in His ministry, John chapter 2, when He had turned water into wine, John moves right into the account of Him cleansing the temple. And the Lord makes this promise, and it's pretty oblique, that if you tear down this temple, I'll rebuild it in 3 days. And He was talking about the temple of His body, but the disciples didn't really know that. But John actually adds a note that after everything had come to pass, well, then they realized it. And as time went on, Jesus got very specific about what was going to happen to Him. He would be arrested. He would be tried. He would be killed. He would rise again from the third day. And even with as specific as He was being, they still missed the point. And so when I talk about people who are confused around the cross, that's what I mean. People who were looking for a kingdom. Matthew chapter 20, which is up there in front in Acts chapter 1, verse 6, looking for this kingdom. They were still looking for something that was going to be physical. They may have even thought and been confused around Jesus' reappearance, His resurrection, thinking that He was a ghost until they got the opportunity themselves to experience the fact that He wasn't. So, what do we see as far as confusion is concerned? Thankfully, we have the benefit of time. We have the blessing, so to speak, of a revealed, completed Word of God. And that Word of God is able to make all of the fine points that's spelling out our understanding of both who Jesus was and why He came down on the earth and how all of that came to pass. And we, of course, are incredibly blessed because of that. And I want you to see in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, and we're going to kind of look at 3 and 4 just for a moment. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, and we look in verse 12. All of us have been made righteous by the plan of God through the blood of Jesus Christ. And so Paul had said in 2 Corinthians 3, verse 12, therefore, since we have such hope, we use great boldness of speech. We, speaking of the apostles, I don't want to wrest this out of the context. We, being the apostles, we can use great boldness of speech. But the point is, all of us, because we have this revealed Word of God, we can use great boldness of speech. So when we talk about the confusion that maybe we still have, we can fix it. And certainly when we talk about the confusion that other people may have to the Word of God, it can be fixed. It can be explained. And if you look at the beautiful language of 17 and 18, look down at 17 and 18. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. But we all, with unveiled face, we know what's going on. By revelation, we know what's going on. It's like the veil, the Old Testament, the veil's been taken away, unveiled face. Beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory, just as by the Spirit of the Lord. And we can help people do that. We can help people see how they can be transformed. You look on down in chapter 4 in verses 3 and 4 again, it's just a beautiful way to put it. But even if our gospel is veiled, it's veiled to those who are perishing, whose minds the God of this age has blinded. There's a lot of blinded people out there because they're hardened or they're indifferent, because they're just simply curious, or maybe because they're confused. They're just blinded. It's veiled to those who are perishing. God of this age has blinded, who do not believe, lest the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is in the image of God, should shine on them. And that's what we can help them do. Have that light of the gospel shine on them. There is something deeply and incredibly compelling about the cross of Jesus Christ. There is something that is so unbelievably attractional about the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I think in short, it can just boil down to kind of what the benefits are, the promises of what you can find in the gospel of Jesus Christ. I mean, look at this. Shattered lives can be mended, misdirected lives can be set on the right course, and listless lives can be revitalized. By what? By the cross. Now again, there's a lot of different groups of people around the cross, just like there were back then. But what the cross reveals and what the cross can do is kind of nothing short of miraculous. So what does it accomplish? Through His condemnation we can have acquittal. Through His sufferings we can have peace and joy. Through His shame comes glory. And through His death comes life. And lo and behold, it's the spectators around the cross, Golgotha, the place of the skull, that teaches us that lesson. They all went out there. Even if you said that every single one of them had completely unpreconceived, no, they all were just a blank slate compared to Jesus. I'm not saying that they were, but let's just take, for example, they were just a blank slate as far as Jesus Christ was concerned. That day, they all saw the same evidence. In fact, I can go even further. Over just a few hours, they all saw the same evidence. And what did some of them do? Some of them believed. Were they in the minority? I would say yes, given the biblical evidence. We're never given a breakdown, but yes, I would say yes. Nevertheless, it was there for people to believe. Regardless of how hardened or indifferent or curious or confused they were, some got through it to real, true acknowledgement and belief. That's what we want for the end of your journey at the cross. To get through all of that, to become not just someone who is a disciple, not just someone who has forsaken all, but someone who's then willing to live all of it out. Tonight we'll talk about the fact that Paul brings up a lot of sports metaphors. Makes me wonder if Paul was a sports fan. So tonight we're going to look at winning God's way. How do I win God's way? Paul tells us how to do it. And that comes from the commitment to what was there on the cross of Jesus Christ. A lot of people back then saw it. Some of them came to the right conclusion. So our whole desire this morning, our whole push this morning, is for you to come to the right conclusion too. For you to take the time to think about what's been done. And maybe you've thought about it and you're ready to obey. Or you think about it and we get to talk some more about you coming to obedience to the cross of Jesus Christ. Do that. Let's respond while we stand and sing.